Welcome to my weekly best of one, best of three, and sometimes a budget deck for Standard in week 2 of the Murders at Karlov Manor. And this week we do get to start things off with a budget list, and we have some of the early data for the tournament winners, as well as the decks that have been performing the best on the best of one ladder. So I'm going to try to get through this as best I can. We've got a couple of things to get through here today for sure. So this one is a budget list centered around Doppelgang by Saffron Olive. And if you haven't had the chance to play with Doppelgang yet, this card is amazing. If you pay 8 mana, so X equals 2, you get a total of 4 copies of whatever you want. And if you pay it for 11, then you get, what, 9 copies of whatever you want? So you can completely overwhelm your opponent as long as you can get to the mana. And that's what this deck is trying to do. It's playing things like Glimpse the Core, which allow you to search for lands, and then we're going to throw in a little bit of cave synergies for like Cosmium Confluence, which can create a 9/9 haste, Invasion of Zendikar, which helps us find our lands, the Spelunking, which allows us to play more, and if we're playing caves, then we gain life, Return from the Wilds, which allows us to search for land and put it into the battlefield tapped. So we're just trying as much as possible to get to a heavy amount of mana. We've got Consuming Tide here, which each player chooses a non-land permanent that they control and return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their owner's hands. Then you draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than you. So Consuming Tide is in here to just kind of stall instead of a Wrath and bounce everything back to their hand. We've got the Shigeki Loop, which you can use this and Colossal Sky Turtle to infinitely loop through your graveyard. And then we've got Virtue of Strength, which allows you to, as an adventure for 1 green, return target creature or land from your graveyard to your hand. And so if you are kind of doing the mill thing with Shigeki, you can use that to get a land from your graveyard, or an important creature like Shigeki. And then you can tap 7 to create an enchantment that makes it so that all of your basics tap for 3 times as much of their mana instead. So this allows us to, access into huge Doppelgang moves. Then we've got Witness Protection here, which is basically in there because Simic is just very poor at spot removal, cheap removal. So Witness Protection is here mostly for a little bit of interaction against our opponent's hands. And then as far as the lands go, we've got the Cavernous Maw for a little bit of cave synergy, Hidden Nursery as well, and then Hidden Cataract from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which allow you to go find, synergize with some of our cave synergies here. And then we've got 1 copy of Field of Ruin to attack problematic manlands. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, here we've got 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke against Domain, Negate as well for against Domain, 2 more copies of Consuming Tide if we really need to continue to, if they're really good at rebuilding their board, we would need to continue to bounce their board. 2 copies of Pick Your Poison, which was each opponent sacrifices an artifact, each opponent sacrifices an enchantment, or each opponent sacrifices a creature with flying. So you're going to bring this one in if you've got problematic enchantments or artifacts or flyers. There was 3 copies of Disdainful Stroke, 2 copies of Eaten by Piranhas, which is kind of like instead of the Witness Protection, this can be a removal. We can change something into a 1/1 at instant speed. And then we've got 3 copies of the Obstinate Baloth, which is nice if you're up against Lily, and there's if your opponent's making you discard cards. All right, as far as the tournament winners go, I always like to look at the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, or MODO. And this week, first place was taken down, Standard Challenge 32 on February 10th by Azorius Tempo by Cabez de And if we compare this to the list that I have that is closest to this would be the list Esper Tempo in week 8 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So we're ditching all of the black cards, but we've got some interesting notes here. So bringing in 2 copies of the Flagi Archaeologist, which the self-mill can kind of help us enable the reanimation off of like Helping Hand and Recommission. Both need cards in our graveyard, so this can kind of help fuel that, as well as make our Haughty Djinn bigger. And this is kind of like, we saw a couple of different takes on Mono Blue with Haughty Djinn got kind of destroyed by Cavern of Souls. And so we saw some exploration with Esper Tempo and Dimir Tempo, where we're replacing the counterspells with the spot removal of black. And then bringing in white was an idea for the Recommission and the Helping Hand, which works particularly well with the Monastery Mentor. And so this is getting rid of the black point removal and just leaning more heavily into just keeping it blue and white. But we've got a couple of cards that we've seen before, like the Ledger Shredder was in that Dimir Tempo deck, and so we're bringing in 4 copies there. We're ditching the 2 copies of Halo Forager, Cut Down, Duress, those are all black cards. Cutting the 1 copy of March of Swirling Mist, which we have seen was kind of a remnant of a previous option in Mono Blue Tempo. We're bringing in 1 more copy of the Otherworldly Gaze. This is a nice way to trigger our Surveil, allows you to put more cards into the graveyard, so it triggers, it's a nice cheap spell to trigger the Prowess and the 1/1 from Monastery Mentor, while also increasing the power of your Haughty Djinn. And so you can surveil all of those spells into the graveyard and increase the power of your Haughty Djinn, as well as, similar to activation of like Philology Archaeologist, to get stuff going into our graveyard to kind of get the tempo train a-rolling. And we're ditching the 3 copies of Chart a Course, which was included in here as some card draw that you could then also discard if you weren't attacking to kind of fill the graveyard, leaning into alternative strategies instead. And let's see here. So we're getting rid of, we're bringing in 4 copies of Get Lost, which is some nice spot removal in white. You can destroy any creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. So it also works kind of like a Destroy Evil against problematic enchantments. Your opponent does get to create 2 map tokens, but we're hoping to pressure our opponent enough that the value that they get off of the map tokens doesn't matter. And then we're cutting the 1 copy of Make Disappear. And as far as the lands go, we're just tweaking it to be Azorius instead. So we're upping the Adarkar Wastes. We're cutting the Dark Slick Shores, bringing in 2 more copies of the Deserted Beach, bringing up the total count of the islands to 5, cutting the Rafine's Tower, and cutting 3 Underground Rivers, for a total of 19 lands instead of the original 20. This is an ultra low land count, but with how much card draw you have, I think that this deck can get away with it. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can they brought in 2 Spell Pierce, which some people like to run this over Negate. It's kind of personal preference. With the lower amount of land, having a 1-cost mana counterspell can be useful. And then as far as the original Esper Tempo sideboard goes, we're ditching the 2 Ledger Shredders. We brought them into the main, getting rid of the Preacher of the Schism and the Bitter Triumph, in lieu of 1 more copy of Destroy Evil, which is particularly good against the Esper Midrange decks, and cutting 1 copy of the Disdainful Stroke. The original one was running 3 copies, this is just running 2. And this is a common sideboard against Domain. And bringing in 2 copies of the Anointed Peacekeeper, which is a nice one. I think it's a nice one against the Domain decks as well. Just anything where you need to remove a problematic spell from your opponent's hand, Anointed Peacekeeper is a pretty nice option. So, and then they have 1 copy of Urkill Master Wizard, which I thought this was like a perfect one to bring in. I hadn't seen this one before. At the beginning of your end step, if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn, which with all those cheap 1-cost blue spells and 1-cost white spells is pretty easy to do, you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, and for each card type among non-creature spells you've cast this turn, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this gives you some nice additional dig if you're needing that. And yeah, I thought it was kind of an interesting one to include. As far as, I would say, also bringing in 2 copies of Knockout Blow, which is like the go-to sideboard option against mono red. Taking out the 2 copies of Duress because we're ditching black. Taking out the 1 copy of Negate, which honestly, if you look at my Esper Midrange sideboard guide that I did on Friday, I'm not 100% sold on Disdainful Stroke over Negate, but that's the direction that they took it. They're cutting out the 1 copy of the Sunset Revelry, which was another one that like is good against the mono red matchup, and taking and bringing in 1 copy of the Welcoming Vampire, which gives us, along with the Hercule, gives us some additional late game draw if we need to try to outvalue like a mid-range opponent. Second place in the Standard Challenge 32 on February 10th goes to Esper Midrange by Victor Esquisi. And if we compare this one to the week that I covered the one that I covered in week 12 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we do see some changes. So we've brought in one additional copy of Dinnik, Pious Apprentice, which works particularly well against the Boros Convoke deck, which I think people were anticipating to see a lot of, and they were not wrong. This was the #1 card in the Esper Midrange sideboard guide that I talked about that against that matchup, so this one's particularly nice to bring in. We're ditching the 3 copies of the Fairy Mastermind, bringing in the 1 copy of the Lauren of the Third Path. This one we've typically seen in the sideboard. Sometimes it makes it into the main, kind of depends on how much the player was anticipating coming up against other enchantment decks, like the Mirror Match. And bringing in 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. It's another one that I covered quite heavily in my Best of 3 sideboard guide for Esper Midrange. And as far as the Best of 3 sideboard goes, we haven't seen too many changes, but there's a couple. One that we've got a new card here from Murders at Karlov Manor, and this one is Long Goodbye. The spell can't be countered, and then destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. I think this is going to be a really nice option over the Go for the Throats, right? Or Anoint with Affliction. Because, like, it depends on how much you're coming up against counter spells, right? Because this one doesn't exile, whereas Anoint with Affliction does. So I'd be curious to see if Long Goodbye ends up replacing Anoint with Affliction, but they decided to do that in this list. So we're up 2 copies of the Long Goodbye, and down 1 copy of Lauren of the Third Path because it's in the main. So this one is deciding not, some lists have the 2 Laurens in the sideboard guide, or in the sideboard, and then this one has got 1 in the sideboard, 1 in the main. And then we're bringing in 3 copies of the Temporary Lockdown, which is another card that works particularly well against the early early board flood strategies, so like Bant Toxic and the Boros Convoke lists. So bringing in some tech there, and then ditching the 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal in the sideboard, bringing it into the main, and cutting the 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction, as well as Cut Down and Parasitic Grasp. Which, I think the little one-ofs in the sideboard were probably worth getting rid of. So I like the changes here. I like the direction that they're taking it, especially with the current state of the meta. 3rd place for the Standard Challenge 32 on February 10th was taken down by Rakdos Midrange by Hamuda. And if we compare this one to the one that I covered in week 9 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we can see that they took it in a different direction. We're bringing in 4 copies of the NT Cynical of the Sun, bringing in 1 copy of the Tenacious Underdog, which is a nice recurring threat. Bringing in 2 more copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and this one is a card that I think is very matchup dependent. I was actually surprised to see them bringing in more copies of it. It does work particularly well against domain and boards or decks that you need to try to outvalue. We're taking out the 3 copies of, or we're bringing in the 3 copies of Archfiend of the Dross. This is a pretty good threat that some decks definitely struggle against. Specifically red, that doesn't have really great removal for the 6 toughness. The one downside with this is if you come up against the Golgari Midrange, which hasn't been a very popular pick these days, but Glissa can remove all of the oil counters from it, and then you just lose the game. So as long as you don't come up against Glissa Sunslayer, the Archfiend of the Dross is one that I can get behind. We're dropping 2 copies of the Geological Appraiser, which was another one that was kind of matchup dependent. It's particularly bad against Sunfall, because on turn 4 you're discovering and just making a bigger board. So depending on how much you're anticipating the 5-cost Wrath, this can be a good card to include or a bad card to include. And we're bringing down 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, as well as the 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal in the main, as well as the 4 copies of the Trumpeting Carnosaur, which was the big red dino that discovers when it enters the battlefield. So we're doing less of a... we've lowered the curve substantially and leaned further away from doing the Cruelty of Gix and the Trumpeting Carnosaurs. So kind of curious to see how this one performs in comparison to the other Rakdos Midrange. And we upped the cut down one, which I definitely liked. When I did my best of 3 sideboard guide, I was like, we just need as much removal as we possibly can to stall for Cruelty of Gix. But this is ditching that plan, so we'll see how this one performs. We're bringing in 3 copies of the Bitter Triumph, which is a nice way to discard. Is good removal. You can pay 3 life, or you can discard a card to destroy target creature or planeswalker. And I was talking to somebody in chat about using like Big Score or like Bitter Triumph to do like the Rakdos Reanimator strategy, and this one is really not doing anything with reanimating the graveyard. So kind of curious to see the 3 copies of the Bitter Triumph in here over, say, just 3 more copies of Go for the Throat. We're ditching the 1 copy of the Anoint with Affliction, ditching 1 copy of Go for the Throat, and cutting the 3 copies of the Cruelty of Gix. As far as the lands go, we've tweaked it a little bit to reflect the changes to the deck. So we're bringing in 1 more copy of the Black Cleave Cliffs, taking out 1 copy of the Cavern of Souls, less Dino synergies overall, and bringing down the Manlands of Restless Vents down by 2, and bringing in 1 more copy of the Sulphurous Springs. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've cut the 1 copy of Abrade and 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction, so just leaning heavily away from the Anoint with Affliction, getting rid of it entirely. And I think that really says that like Golgari midrange, especially with the inclusion of Archfiend of the Dross, Hamuda was just not anticipating coming up against any Golgari midrange. So let's see, we've also ditched the Breach the Multiverse, which was kind of like the Hail Mary against Domain, and the previous deck really struggled against Domain. Curious to see if this matchup is a little bit more favorable, since you do have a lower curve and maybe you're a little bit less susceptible to your enemy's Sunfalls. As far as bringing in 1 Obnixilis the Adversary, which is a nice mid-range threat. There, if your opponent doesn't have the hate for Planeswalkers specifically, like Planeswalkers will get around Wraths, so sometimes like Obnixilis the Adversary could be a good thing to bring in against like Domain, for example, or Azorius Control. Cutting the 2 copies of Cut Down from the sideboard, as well as Go for the Throat, so just not running any point removal in the sideboard. And then the reason why the previous one was running more in the sideboard and then wasn't just running it all in the main was because it was particularly bad against Domain, where to have a whole bunch of spot removal, Domain doesn't have a whole lot of targets. So if your opponent is ramping into Sunfalls, you kind of just sit there with dead cards in hand. So they're ditching that strategy, although we still see a couple of cards that were in the previous sideboard, like Extract the Truth. I'm not 100% sold on Extract the Truth, but, we'll see how it goes. Let's see here. What else? Yeah, so they are still running 2 copies of Cruelty of Gix, but they've moved him here into the sideboard. There are some matchups where the Cruelty of Gix is good. There are some matches where the Cruelty of Gix is bad, and the faster the matchup, the worse the Cruelty of Gix is, and the more enchantment hate and negates and such that they have. So I think bringing this in is kind of an interesting idea, because if you're up against like the Boros Convoke deck, you definitely don't want the Cruelty of Gix to be in your main. And then if you're up against a more grindy matchup, you can bring the Cruelty of Gix in. So I thought that was kind of an interesting approach. And we've also got 2 Paths of Peril, which I think is another kind of like alternative to the Brotherhood's End. You can also do the Path of Peril. This allows us to wipe the board of cheap things. It's kind of like a temporary lockdown, but in black. And so bringing in more copies of that, anticipating board flood strategies of Bant Toxic and Boros Convoke. And then last but not least, we've got 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal in the sideboard. So taking it out of the main, putting it into the sideboard, again, similar to the Cruelty of Gix, bring it in when the matchup is advantageous to do so. Now, notably, Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal is good against mono red, and the lifelink, as long as you can get to the 5, like, I think is a good one. I'm surprised to actually see it here with the way that they've set everything up, to not be in the main and to be in the sideboard, but, to each their own. So on to the next standard challenge here. First place was taken down, took down the standard challenge 64 on February 11th by Esper Midrange by Bless Vaughn. And so you can see this week, the Esper Midrange decks did very well in the standard challenge tournaments. And I think that largely has to do with how much Boros Convoke there was. But yeah, we see similar things here. If we compare this to the week 12 list from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, 1 more additional copy of Dinnik. Again, really good against the Boros Convoke strategy. This one is not going for the Fairy Mastermind, as ditching the 3 copies there. Ditching the 1 copy of Lord Skitter, Sewer King, and as well as the 2 copies of the Tashana's Tidebinder in the main. and bringing in Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which this card does well against the mono red and the Boros Convoke strategies, so I'm not surprised to see this one just being included in the main. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of Destroy Evil into the main, probably anticipating more Esper Midrange to counter the Boros Convoke, and then bringing in 2 copies of Gix's Command, which is a nice card for countering the go wide strategies where you can just wrath the board and destroy each creature with power 2 or less. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we see some similarities as well. We were ditching the 1 Parasitic Grasp, cutting 2 copies of Destroy Evil because we brought them in from the sideboard to the main, and then 3 copies of the Kaido Shizuki, and we've seen this one kind of come and go. So this one is a nice one if you're coming up against Wraths. Planeswalkers don't get hit by Wraths. And then we've got Nightclubber, which I thought was kind of an interesting inclusion, and I think is good against the Boros Convoke and the Bant Toxic. Nice one to explore. When it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponent's control get -1/-1 until end of turn. And then it has Blitz. 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown, which is good for the board flood strategies of Bant Toxic and Boros Convoke. Cutting out the 1 copy of the Cut Down that was sitting in the sideboard, as well as the 2 copies of the Knockout Blow. And I like that. If you go and look at my best of 3 sideboard guide that I covered on Friday, I think the Knockout Blow isn't necessary for Esper Midrange specifically because you already have Cut Downs and Go for the Throats. So I like that the insights that I was talking about on Friday are reflected in this, the first place winner on the sideboard guide. So that always makes me feel good. All right, second place for the Standard Challenge 64 on February 11th was taken down by Azorius Control by Thanks EOT. And if we compare this one to the list that I covered in week 12 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we can see that there is a different approach here. So they're ditching the 4 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind and not going for a mill strategy, taking out the 1 copy of Elspeth's Smite, bringing in 4 more copies of No More Lies, which was the Azorius counterspell that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor. Allows you to counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, and then if it's countered, it is exiled instead of put into your opponent's graveyard. We're seeing this in more and more lists. And then bringing in 4 copies of Quick Study, which we saw being explored during Wilds of Eldraine, I believe. And it's just a nice way to, cheap divination at instant speed. And ditching the 2 copies of Negate in the main, as well as Silver Scrutiny, the 4 copies of Sunset Revelry, which I thought was a little bit surprising. I guess because you got the Temporary Lockdowns, you'd go in that direction instead of the Sunset Revelry. Ditching the 1 copy of the Celestis and bringing in 2 more copies of Sunfall, up to a total of 4. And bringing in 4 copies of the Temporary Lockdown, which is why the Sunset Revelries are there, I'm guessing. Or not there, I should say. And then as far as the lands go, we've tweaked the Darker Wastes up to a total of 4 for the Azorius Painland, and brought in 1 copy of Mirix. And we're down the 4 copies of the Sea Chrome Coast, which is the Azorius Fastland. As far as the best of 3 sideboard here, we've got a very clean best of 3 sideboard guide. I really like this one. So we've got 3 copies of Negate, which you're going to bring in against like Domain. 4 copies of Knockout Blow, which you're going to bring in against red, against mono red. 4 copies of the Chrome Host Sea Shark, which you're going to bring in if you need some more mid-range threats. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, which if you've got a good target for Tishana's Tidebinder, like this is another one that you can bring in against Domain to silence your opponent's Atraxas. The list of the targets that this hits is long, but it's as long as you've got a good target to bring it in, then it's a good sideboard to have. And then third place for the Standard Challenge 64 on February 11th, it was done by Esper Midrange by Mohammed bin Salman. Sorry if I butchered your name. So if we compare this one to week 12, so there's 3 different approaches of Esper Midrange. And the reason why I didn't just cover it all at once was because Esper Midrange is so varied in the versatility of what you can bring in from the best of 3 sideboard. It is why it's one of the best of 3 decks, right? So I wanted to cover all 3 variations so you could see, especially along with my best of 3 sideboard guide, what the professionals are doing in certain matchups and why. So this one is probably the closest to the list that I covered in week 12 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. They did not bring in an additional copy of Dinnik Pious Apprentice. They did they did cut the 1 copy of Lord Skitter, Sewer King, and they did bring in 1... Sorry, I've been talking too long. I got a little frog in my throat. And they did bring in 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is one that we've seen in the sideboard, so they did decide to bring that into the main. So, ditching the 1 Lord Skitter for an Aclazot's. And then as far as the sideboard goes, they did bring in 3 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. I do think we're going to see this being played in a lot, especially with Boros Convoke and Bant Toxic, making this a very good sideboard option. Ditched 1 copy of the Lorn of the Third Path, which I can't really get behind. I think I mean, maybe the Destroy Evils are enough against the Esper Midrange matchup, and if you look at the sideboard guide, you'll notice that the Lorn of the Third Path wasn't actually as good as just bringing in Destroy Evils. But yeah, I'm not 100% sold on cutting the 1 copy of the Lorn of the Third Path. But again, I'm not here to just totally judge what they're doing. I'm just trying to tell you guys what they've done, right? As far as, oh yeah, they also ditched the 1 copy of the Parasitic Grasp and the 1 copy of Cutdown, which I do get behind. All right, and that is enough of best of 3. Looking at best of 1, we've seen some early front runners. It's really close between Boros Convoke and Mono Red Aggro for being the best archetype, according to the Untapped tracker for Bronze to Mythic. So if we compare this to the list that I explored on on Saturday, and the one that I showcased last week on week 1 of Murders at Karlov Manor, we can see that they are similar lists, but they vary a little bit. So running 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, which is particularly good against mono red, running 1 copy of the Regal Bunnycorn, which gives us a larger threat, and running 3 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, which gives us a little bit better board presence. And then 1 less copy of the War Leader's Call. The one I was looking at was running 4. No Stoke the Flames, so no Convoke late game reach. Just going for threats over spells. Cutting the 1 copy of the Virtue of Loyalty, which really fell out of place. And then the lands, we're bringing in 1 mountain over Sokenzon, so they're cutting the Sokenzon down to 2, or down from 2 to 1. Cutting the 3 copies of the cutting out 3 copies of Sundown Pass, which I can get behind. The deck is very quick, so having something that is only untapped on 2 or other is just not great. And so I definitely support this change. And bringing in 4 copies of the Thran Portal, which is kind of like the opposite way of doing it, right? It comes in tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. So this one is good as long as the game is over quickly. So, and we don't really care about our life total. Bringing in 1 copy of Merrick's, which I can take it or leave it. I don't think you really need this against like the board wipes and whatnot to like edge out a win, but maybe you get 1. And then cutting out the 2 copies of the Restless Bivouac, which was the Boros Manland. Number 2, according to Untapped, from Bronze to Mythic, was Mono Red Aggro. And if we compare this to the one that I was speculating, some changes we might see in week 1 of Murders at Karlov Manor, we did not really see anything exciting. This is just an old list, so we're no frantic scapegoats. We're back to the 4 copies of Phoenix Chick, no fugitive code breakers, ditching 1 copy of Godric down to 2 from 3. We've seen this a couple of, throughout the weeks. Godric tends to fluctuate a little bit. And so this one's leaning into 2. And then we're leaning more heavily into the Monstrous Rages, bringing that total up to a total of 4. Not running additional shocks, so I was thinking maybe we'd actually run 6 copies with Play with Fire. And, it might be too soon to actually see the Murders of Karlov Manor really coming into full effect. But so far, just the boring old mono-red list here. Down 1 copy of Mishra's Foundry, not running 4, just running 3, and then including 1 more Sokenzon Crucible of Defiance for a total of 2, because it synergizes nicely with the Godric Celebration. And, yeah. All right, number 3 was Azorius Control, from Bronze to Mythic, and if we compare this to my speculations in week 1 of Murders of Karlov Manor, we do see some inclusions, but not all of them. So this one is not running Ezram, Agency Thief, is not running the Hornlock Whale. That one was just one that was an alternative threat if we're ditching out on the Jace, the Perfected Mind. And this one is leaning into Jace, the Perfected Mind, for milling out as a win condition. Not bringing in Deduce, which was the clue token and draw a card for 1 and a blue. not main boarding the 2 copies of Destroy Evil or the 4 copies of Get Lost, and instead, yeah, running the original just 4 Wandering Emperors, 4 Jace the Perfected Minds, running 2 copies of Sunset Revelry, even though there is 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown, which I like. I think that Sunset Revelry is particularly good against mono red, and especially in best of 1, I don't mind running both. So I'm happy to see that one being brought back in. We're bringing in 2 copies of the March of Otherworldly Light, which is really good spot removal. 4 copies of the Soul Partition, which allows you to exile something, but it doesn't go away forever. The spell can then be cast again for 2 more to cast, but it does slow down your opponent until you can start wrathing your opponent into oblivion. And then we're running 1 copy of Negate in the main, as well as 2 copies of the Celestus, which we've seen before in Azorius Control lists. As far as the lands go, we see some changes, so a Darker Waste down to 3 from 4, not running a Gonjo in the list here, not running 4 copies of Field of Ruin, just 1, but we are bringing in 4 copies of Demolition Field, which is basically the same as the Field of Ruin, and then bringing in 2 copies of the Seachrome Coast, which is the Azorius Fast Land, and then cutting out the 1 copy of Mirix. Number 4, according to Untapped for Bronze to Mythic, was the Selesnya Enchantments list, and there's been very few changes with this one. Currently, the one that is running, taking out the 4 copies of Brushland for 2 more forests and 2 more plains. So the Brushland is the green-white Painland. That one has been doing better than the one that is running with the Brushland, and so this is, you know, every set I have to bump Selesnya Enchantments in case you haven't seen the list. This one has been around for a while and is very optimized, and I think is a good one to craft as long as you're okay with, you know, running it until September, where we expect to lose some of the cards in the list. And number 12 on the list, yes, 12 decks this week, holy cow. Number 5, according to Untapped for Bronze to Mythic, was the Orzhov Lifegain, which works particularly well against some of the aggro strategies in Best of 1. So this one I covered in week 11 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I think it was the last deck that I covered for that set. And we see some changes. So we're bringing the Ellis Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim down from 3 copies to 2. And this one's kind of like an additional Lunarch Veteran, allows you to trigger whenever a creature enters the battlefield, gaining 1 life. But it is legendary, so you can't have multiple copies. Bringing in the 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat, which I'm surprised wasn't in the first list to begin with, because you get a 1/1 flying lifelinker that affects your opponent's interaction. Bringing in 2 copies of the Extraction Specialist, which is nice to bring back something like the Deep Cavern Bat that they had just removed. And ditching 3 copies of the Resplendent Angel, which was... I like that, because honestly, like, the Resplendent Angel did win me some games, but really, it doesn't... it's kind of hard to get the gain 5 and then have this also not just be killed by your opponent's removal. So I can get behind only having 1 copy of the Resplendent Angel there. Dropping Shieldred, the Apocalypse down from 3 to 2 copies. I like Shieldred. I think it works pretty well as long as you can survive till turn 4. But yeah, it has its own setbacks, and it's not particularly good if you are bumping into a lot of control, which I have been bumping into a fair amount of control matchups. So I think that's kind of why we're dropping the Shieldred, the Apocalypse. Also cutting the 3 copies of the Steel Seraph, which was the colorless 3/3 flyer with prototype that you can either play for 6 colorless or 1 double pip white, and then you can give something flying, vigilance, or lifelink. And so getting rid of that one, and bringing in Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, the flying lifelink recurring threat, which I think is a good one to include and then bringing out 1 copy of the Virtue of Persistence, and bringing in 4 copies of Case of the Uneaten Beast, which is a new card from Murders at Karlov Manor. It allows you to have the Lunarch Veteran, and it's kind of why we're dropping the Sadistic Pilgrim down to 2 as well, is that it gives you that effect whenever a creature enters the battlefield you control. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and then to solve, you gain 5 or more life this turn, which off of the food tokens from like the Gumdrop Poisoner is very achievable. And then you can sacrifice this to be able to cast cards from your graveyard until end of turn, which has a little bit of anti-synergy with the Virtue of Persistence if you're going to be bringing those back. So I like the drop 1 here if you're going to be playing the Case of the Uneaten Feasts. So as far as the lands go, we've ditched the 2 copies of Mirrex to bring in just 2 copies of Plains, which I like because the Mirrex was definitely a problem if you're going to be trying to play like Amalia as well as the Sadistic Pilgrim both want white-black, which Mirrex does not work particularly well if you have to play it on turn 1 or turn 2, and then ending up with the double pip blacks. It was very awkward to have the Mirrex in the when I ran it, so I like that change. Bringing down the swamps to a total of 2 from 5. We're just cutting out a lot of the black cards and leaning towards, you know, like more 1-costed white cards, so it makes sense to skew things more towards white. And then we're bringing in 1 Scoured Barrens, which also, you know, gives you the life gain trigger off of one of your lands. So if you like this sort of thing, remember to hit like and subscribe. I do one of these every Sunday. And there will be a vote here on YouTube as well about what you would like to see from this list of the best of 1 decks for the 50-match summary. So I'll try to remember to put all 5 on there to explore, although the Boros Convoke, I just ran Boros Convoke, so I might leave that one off the list. I'll have to kind of decide if it's different enough to justify putting it on there, putting it on the vote. But hope this is useful. Please feel free to let me know if this was something that you enjoy. I always love reading your comments about what worked and what didn't work, or what you think could be included. And you know, discussing Magic the Gathering cards is why I do this. And good luck with your matches, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.